think it's very appropriate, though, that the first seminar that the humanities folk are working on is given by our new head of music. Chats has only been here a matter of weeks. I think he turned up on the 1st of February, and already he's making himself felt in the corridors of power, which is what one wants to do if one is up for professorial rank. I think that I don't want to make a political point, but I do think that the professoriate have stood back somewhat in recent times, and that I think it's no bad thing for them to assert themselves. And one of the way of asserting oneself is in the intellectual field and the academic field in events like this afternoon. So the seminar is going to be held. The format, I take it you've all got your programs. There will be a music piece, then Professor Devroop will deliver his presentation, and then Professor de la Porte will respond to it. Professor Devroop is a distinguished colleague. He has extensive experience at the University of Tshwane, the University of South Africa. He comes to the humanities and the School of Arts, in particular in the humanities, at a time where I think things are beginning to happen, and the whole atmosphere around the creative and the performing arts is something that attention is at long last being paid to. So to drive that through, we do need people of his caliber, and so I'm particularly pleased that we were able to appoint him, and that he's going to deliver his presentation now. This will not, of course, get him out of delivering an inaugural lecture when he becomes a full professor, but that's another matter. Okay, Neil, Prof, over to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for sacrificing your Friday afternoon just before a public holiday on Monday to come and listen to a talk on aesthetics. I'm going to start off this afternoon with a short piece, and this is at the request of our host, I think it's the Directorate, if I'm not sure, or the Department of Teaching and Learning, and the initiative of Dr. Dunpert, who actually called upon me to do this presentation. He said it would be nice, if you're talking about aesthetics, to do something related with a performance before you can actually start your talk. So I've chosen a piece that Neil and I are pretty familiar with. The title of the piece is not so important, but I think what's more important is the aesthetic experience. And what I've done here is try to explore possibilities of instruments that exist outside the realm of a particular genre. In other words, when we listen to music, if it's popular music, we expect to be hearing an electric guitar or an amplified guitar or perhaps electric piano or a synthesizer or a drum kit. For that matter, jazz has always historically been associated with the saxophone. You see a saxophone, people immediately form this connection, something to do jazz. But what we're trying to do here is we've taken a pop piece, actually, composed by Dusty Springfield. And I'm trying to reimagine this firstly on an instrument, an Indian instrument. This instrument comes from South India, called the bansuri, made of bamboo. And we've decided to work on a collaboration on this particular piece. Neil and I have performed this piece once before down in Pietermaritzburg, but as you know, with music, we had a long chat yesterday, Neil and I, about the experience in the moment, and I think that's what's important. When one talks about aesthetics, that for us is quite important. How do you feel in the moment? So the piece is not there for analysis or for deconstruction, it's just there for your enjoyment, and I hope you enjoy it before we start with the actual the unreal stuff, deconstructing what I'm trying to do here. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Neil Gonzalez on piano. Sensing the curriculum, the role of aesthetics in higher education. In supply and demand, I argue that throughout the 20th century, the critical capacity for the university steadily migrates away into three surrounding institutions. Technocracies, which apply expertise to the management of society, take over the tasks of knowledge management, of establishing and testing norms and building a critical consensus throughout the areas of expertise in order to develop reliable knowledge. Since the beginning of the Cold War, this process has included the requirement that all public administrations need to manage risk. This is intensified through our natural resource crisis and our preparedness for post-militarized global war. Compared to the reach and resources of technocracies, the university can no longer be thought of as the primary source of reliable knowledge, the forms of its applications and revision, and hence of society's normative performance standards for expertise. Critical inquiry, research, and relentless debate has migrated from the graduate school to the research and development resources of global capitalism. To ensure against stagnation, to smooth the business cycle, capital invests incalculable sums in adapting or reverse engineering, in other words, questioning itself. All aspects of its practice, whether global or minute, are subject to a constant drive for improvement, to preempt the failure of returns. Only innovation applied to every link in the system ensures profitable reinvestment. Hence, research and development, critical questioning of what might happen, questing for improved alternatives to every practice, concept, and techniques occurs today within the private sphere of operational, technological, or fundamental research. The best graduate schools simply become its entry portals. Where once faculties of law, history, humanities, and the arts hosted scholarship and writing on behalf of their society, while searching for the best perspectives from which to inform public opinion. Now the social and specialist media launch matters of concern that create their own public, track and carefully develop the range of opinions within it. The encyclopedic and systematizing functions of university disciplines no longer inform the course of debate, its conclusions and resolutions. Instead, academics use the dynamic media-based debates around them for clues to inform the relevance of their own future research and publication. They have become a post facto attempt to provide a space of reflection, of learned gravitas, to themes and topics, forming and dissolving like clouds far from the traditional reaches of the humanistic curriculum. Given such a scenario in which the university has lost participation and authority in the areas of the normative rationality of expertise and standards, in innovation, and increasingly in the ground rules of public debate, what has it got left to assert its belonging in a world run by technocracy, shaped by the global capital cycle and directly molding public concerns via media? If it cannot directly compete with larger projections of knowledge management, monetizable research, and today's social imagination, does it at least have an asset of its own through which it can claim retention in a world in which the intellectual property of university can be offered freely in MOOCs courses? Even the Harvards and MITs are beginning to identify their primary value in opportunities they provide for networking, for brokerage between technocrats, capitalist research, and the civic concerns of the social media instead of in their knowledge content. Will the university live on purely as a form And will the best examples of this form resemble the elite country or gentleman's club, Masonic brotherhoods, or insider trading? The question in today's seminar is the curriculum and whether it could be improved or win some new freedom if it adopted underpinning analogies and metaphors from the methods and imagery of aesthetics. To address this, it is important to try to isolate the nature and function of a curriculum beyond the management imagery in which it is usually encountered today. The curriculum has become one factor among many in the functions of ensuring the optimal throughput of students from registration to graduation, in measuring the relevance of learning to performance in labor markets or meeting of sector needs. Internally, the curriculum is treated as a field of adaptation, as a breeding ground where mutations arise, principles of selection are applied, and hopeful new species of learning struggle out of the waters on their badly formed limbs to establish themselves on dry ground. A careful student of university curriculae quickly sees the traces of contemporary technocracies in the way the study path is conceived of and managed. Between, say, the University of Bologna and the Brussels European Union administration, there is an indiscernible zone of shared assumptions, concerns, and procedures that make it very difficult to decide whether the Bologna Accord is a harmonization that was derived from a university but was relayed to all of Europe through the EU, or was derived from the EU and condensed and focused on universities through the ancient institution of Bologna. Similar impressions are gained when comparing the Google campus to any other campus, Bell Labs or Silicon Valley, which is its offshoot, to a university laboratory, or the deliberations of the World Bank to a top department of economics. Today, the contributions of political scientists and policy writers to presidential campaigns live endangered by Twitter, by the apparent idiosyncrasies of media presence. The obvious conclusion is that the relationship between the curriculum and knowledge in its contemporary frames cannot be ensured. Therefore, the relations between the curriculum and learning have become opaque. The University of Hard Knocks has become considerably softer and often stands better equipped than 9/10 of today's campuses. Perhaps never before in history have knowledge, techniques, criticism, and judgment been more widely dispersed, but also more difficult to encapsulate and evaluate by a manageable set of yardsticks. Is the curriculum, therefore, the one asset the university possesses, uniquely controls, and drives into the future, or is it the university's single greatest liability? Maintaining it in the illusion that it can relevantly compress and express the sum of the world's reliable decision-making, critical self-evaluation, and deepened judgments. Would the university not perhaps be better off without a distinct and possibly redundant curricular level? Should it instead be free to pursue the outsourcing of these important functions to the agencies and resources in society which today carry them out so effectively? It is easy to predict the average academic's outrage and incredulity at this suggestion. They will unanimously proclaim that technocracy, capitalism, and the public realm are unable to exert a critical scrutiny upon themselves. In short, the university's magic additional ingredient is critique. Like those irritating pioneers of proprietary software who required an activating dongle. I don't know if you remember that era, you know, where you had a dongle to start a computer program. Is the university merely a password required for the rest of the world to believe in the effectiveness of its critical capacity? Or Is it too late for any single institution to naively recover the dream of reserving assured and effective critical reflection to itself? This strange hope does, however, highlight something important but easy to overlook in the university, and that is the basis of its erstwhile claims: to be able to carry out a comprehensive critique of knowledge, practice, and judgment. The historically alert ear cannot fail to recognize in this Kant's three famous critiques. Kant's endeavor did not only stylize the concerns as well as the approaches of philosophy to its aims for 200 years, but also reverberated powerfully through the debates and resolution that launched the German university. Why this nation's conception of university should remain so overrepresented in the self-understanding of universities throughout the world stems from two historical circumstances. Unlike America and France, Germany's aspirations to sweeping social reform were frustrated and delayed throughout the 19th century. This permitted, as Marx, Nietzsche, and many others have pointed out, a prolonged and one-sided concern with culture, civil society, and ideal institutions to express these in place of the more practical but delayed task of social transformation. Within this utopian design of a desirable future, one of the few realizable goals were reformed institutions of learning. Hence, universities became the test beds of otherwise frustrated German revolutionary thinking, and hence their receptiveness to visions of knowledge reform developed within philosophy, and most powerfully by Immanuel Kant. Those who know Kant's work will indulge me restating briefly and crudely his aims, which still provide a yardstick in knowledge and learning. Kant divides our aspirations to know and act autonomously in three. He shows that the kind of competence, concepts, and skills judgments needed to have reliable knowledge of nature differ from the capacities needed to act rationally and justly. Hence, the distinction in focus and approach between his critique of pure reason that sets out the conditions for objective knowledge or science, and the critique of practical reason that sets out the conditions under which actions can be reasoned about and justified. In the differences between these treatises on how reason is to be had and applied are all the differences between the faculties of science and engineering, and those of law and the humanities. For Kant, blurring the distinctions between the two critiques in search of a common foundation or method could only result in fruitless debates. And so too for the utopian universities applying him. Interdisciplinarity or rivalry between the sciences and the humanities is from the outset, and for good reasons, pointless. There is, however, a third critique that deals with the conditions under which the human power of judgment, which is so much a part of our freedom and autonomy, can be fruitfully exercised. This question goes beyond the role of judgment in science, which is exemplified by experiment and consensus-seeking argument, or in politics, morality, and matters of social justice, where the very identity of an action depends upon the way we judge it. The critique of judgment seeks from the outset those strange and difficult examples that we cannot avoid encountering, but are obliged to take some position on, and hence may or may not expect fruitful outcomes of. Revealingly, Kant chooses to discuss aesthetics, which is a judgment arrived at through the use of our senses, along with organic form, and their explanation by aims rather than causes, which involve us simply because we are alive, and history as a cultural creation alongside one another in his treatise on judgment. It should be clear that neither the sensory, living, nor the historical can be usefully addressed by the natural science or become the theme of a political or civic deliberation. Many of you may be asking, which university faculty or faculties derived their rationale from Kant's critique of the power of judgment? In other words, what activities in the university stand or fall by the capacity, accuracy, and sophistication of judgment alone? And how can such pivotal judgments be cultivated or taught? Again, the answer can be approached along divided lines. Institutionally, universities have taught courses in aesthetics, have hosted medical schools or departments of biology, and also housed and encouraged historians. Doctrinally, Kant has provided the map of these terrains, as well as direction for fruitful navigating across them in accordance with self-critical aims. In other words, he seeks to provide us with the only thing that critical thought can provide us with, and that is how to avoid from the outset error and illusion arising from the misuse or misapplication of our own faculties. A critique of any kind cannot give us the subject matter of aesthetics, of an inquiry into the living or into history, for this is down to scholarship and research. But it can inform us how to conduct ourselves on these terrains in a way that will keep us free of certain unavoidable mistakes and illusions that come about from misusing our own conceptual resources. From this dizzy combination of brave new 19th century university faculties and Kant's three critical appraisals of the scope and limits of reason, all universities in the German mode have the impression of dealing with two distinct resources, the empirical and the documentary contents of knowledge, which are the subjects to usual tests and trials of authenticity, validity, sampling, reliability. But at the same time, the transcendental architecture of judgments, categories, and concepts, which critique or self-reflection of these capacities on their workings and limits can refine. The university is, therefore, uniquely placed in knowledge between a constant critical refinement of its form and a voracious expansion of its contents. Having shown the only three ways in which it is worthwhile of having an exercise of reason, Kant also laid out the three possible areas of activity for a university, insofar as it wishes to distinguish itself from a dogmatic or doctrinal institution, or from a process fueled entirely by common sense and widespread public belief. Hence, we arrive at today's seminar in which we ask ourselves whether the aesthetics, which the university can only host and comprehend as an exercise of the power of judgment, but not as an objective subject matter or a rationally resolvable dispute, might be the right therapy for that aging relative, the curriculum. This marriage between a powerful conception of knowledge and experience and an ideal institution could easily have become a failed experiment if it were not built on receptive and long-prepared foundations. As is well known, universities are an invention of fairly recent date. The oldest in Europe is barely 1,000 years old. It was not, of course, devised according to principles of higher learning and inquiry, or by reviving the model of the ancient academy. It was a byproduct of religious rivalry between the Vatican and Bologna Cathedral, which, being better funded, threatened to become the larger institution. The Pope banned Bologna from teaching doctrine, and hence its immense collection of manuscripts assembled for this purpose was monetized. All those representing seminaries were allowed to copy the contents of this library, and did so in the form of the lecture. A reader sounding the text and providing commentary where necessary for an audience of writers, copyists, who consciously duplicated the substance in the core and the reflections in the margins. This duplicating reservoir, no longer part of the church, had to be given the right to exist by the city and hence became the university, liable to certain taxations and rules from which foreign students who made up the main body were exempt. Thus was established the notion of academic freedom, or the right to travel and copy under the protection of, but without obligation to, Europe's major cities. By the century preceding Kant and his modern university, manuscripts and the need for copying had disappeared. The original university stockpile appeared in print, along with countless other new publications gathered under royal repositories. These not only contained the codes and transcripts of the laws, but also aimed to organize totalities of knowledge and learning. In this, the national libraries resembled the vast botanical or zoological gardens and royal collections of art and antiquities, and the cabinets of curiosities, which established homes for the exotic and the strange in Europe. This is the era of comprehensive encyclopedism based on the idea of orders or tabulations, which may be infinitely perfected. Communicating between these were the various proposals for a universal language, a system such as that Leibniz proposed, capable of being the alphabet for these endless collections and arrangements, for transcribing all images, relations, sounds, words, and concepts into its perfect and unambiguous ciphers. In this period, learning and knowledge were mainly about the collation of different regions of the known. There was no upper limit to these collations, which ushered in the era of collation in science, as seen in Newton's correspondence. In expeditions to map and inventory of what was accessible on the globe, this was done in the ambition that everything could be explained by breaking it down, by reverse engineering down to its indivisible and necessary components, as in the vision of Descartes. This was a republic of learning aimed at completing itself at infinity. This early phase of the Enlightenment would be turned inside out like a glove by Immanuel Kant, who introduced the theme of productive limits into the unlimited and of finitude to this infinity. It was no longer possible to believe in the goal of knowing exhaustively, but only of learning to make the best and most reasonable judgment possible under the inevitable constraints and limitations of circumstance. It should be clear that it is these constraining circumstances and limits that Kant is talking about when he proposes the three domains in which reason can be applied and experience interrogated with a good probability of the exercise being fruitful. Nature is the constraint for the critique of pure reason, since our contact with it can never be taken as exhaustive, even under the most ingenious of laboratory conditions. Freedom is the constraint in matters of action, since no consensus can hope to speak for the future discontents or imaginings of autonomous agents who are prepared to pay the price for change. In the exercise of judgment, which concerns us today in our attempt to better understand how aesthetics and the curriculum came together the first time under the prompting of Kant. The limit is given by the fact that we, the judges, cannot disentangle ourselves from what we are called upon to judge. If it is history, we are aware of ourselves as historic beings who are carried along and defined by that process to which we are attempting to give definition. If it is the living totality, then we must be aware that we are organisms ourselves, and that through us, life is trying to gain knowledge of life. In aesthetics, and everything falling within its scope, we cannot forget that such subject matter is only given to us through our senses, and without them, and the discriminations we may exercise upon them, we will have no conception of the aesthetic object. With finitude firmly established, the 18th century ideal of being able to survey all knowledge is abandoned. Human experience is no longer seen as a kind of universal for all matters epistemic and practical. In the German university constituted upon Kant, the natural sciences proceed carefully along a narrow and conservative ledge in which all theory must build comprehensive contact with experiment, and all experiment must devise its comprehensive development of evidence. This delicately managed chain gave rise to spectacular discoveries and results, establishing the fields of inorganic and organic chemistry, experimental physiology, neuroanatomy, as well as the physics of energy, and fields that went well beyond any conceptions of Newton. In the humanities, the manuscripts and books of the previous eras were subject to a philological scrutiny, put in a perspective in which thought and sensibility could only be seen to be evolving within words and their time-bound particularity. In the field of law and civics, the state suddenly appeared as the entity brought about and driven by limited component forces, particular social interest, idiosyncratic pacts and contracts, instead of the metaphysical replacement for the sovereign that it seemed to be as recently as the American and French revolutions. So much for the impact on learning of the first two critiques. They established a perspective rather than a subject matter, and through adherence to the perspective, which is one of the productive constraints, many subject matters for teaching and learning arose, and a cohesive horizon of research and inquiry suggested itself. These are the yields of the first Western experiment in radical self-reliance. No beliefs and conclusions about ourselves insofar as we endorse, inherit, and operate within indigenously Western institutions, such as a university, can even be taken seriously unless we too climb into this infernal and unpredictable machine of self-reliance and abandon any appeal, even the most tempered or vague, to authority. Let us move on to the fate of the aesthetic in this stringent experimental climate. You will recall that it appears alongside two other unambiguous examples of reflexive judgment, situations in which the experiencer and the experienced cannot distance themselves from one another. To a simpler age than ours, this mutual entanglement might have appeared as a vicious circle, as a sealed zone which cannot be confidently or properly entered, and hence as a cause for skepticism towards knowing anything about life, history, or the possible yields of the senses. Kant's insight, which today still licenses our historical, vital, and aesthetic inquiries as something more than sheer speculation, was that this entanglement, far from being impenetrable, is in fact a productive limit. As you may gather by now, for Kant, it is limits, or the expression of finitude, which are the conditions under which reliable knowledge can get going in the first place. What is the yield that we can expect from the pure exercise of judgment on these torturous Mobius strip? Now, I did actually have a video for you on this, giving you an example, but it's a YouTube video that cannot possibly play on this machine. If you go online and just Google it or go onto YouTube, it's the Mobius strip of Bach's canon, where you can actually see what I'm referring to here. It is clearly not the yielding of history, organic totality, or the aesthetic as an object with its appropriate range of qualities, properties, and powers. For that to be the case, these objects would originate in nature, our pursuit of them, and would take the form of a science, and they would function as the ultimate constraint of our inquiry. This would effectively remove our implication in them, which Kant identifies as the key characteristic as a group. we would be no more involved in the scripts of history, life, or sensory experience than we are involved in the existence of photons, except in those rare conditions in which we elicit them artificially in the laboratories. We can also not expect our attempts to arrive at conclusions about history, organic totality, and the aesthetic to take the form of a widespread and broadly accepted consensus, because in our stance towards these three reflexively accessed realities, we are not primarily exercising our powers as agents, as we do when we are citizens or entering contracts or seeking to sway public opinion through politics. The idea of action in history, life, or the senses is difficult to formulate except by analogy or for dramatic effect. Therefore, these three fields are not a basis for adjudicating actions. Clearly, something quite unusual is called for by all of us who study and teach in those proximity to these strange paradoxical domains. Here, we may switch from Kant's deliberations on the form of this problem and to the ingenious additions philosophers in his wake have given to this, and look to the other ingredient in the alloy, the modern university. You will recall that we left this adventurous offspring of the ancient or sacred manuscript world at the point where it was saturated with books, with encyclopedic learning, with the infinity of knowable facts. But once it had taken Kant's manifestos fully on board, it would have had no other field of its own to apply them to than this 18th century universe of print expanding into every direction. Just as Kant had characterized 18th century knowledge with its regulative infinitude as metaphysical speculation, so the university had to fold the 18th century library with similar ingenuity in order to give it access through its interior. The university, an institution mandated to a particular media regime of writing and speaking, could not simply launch upon and occupy the adventure of experimental, natural knowledge, or the just and rational reorganization of civil society as predicated on the two first critiques of Kant. This task of teaching and learning through speaking and writing required that it render these two characteristic feats of modernity available through books and those commentaries on books we today call lectures and assignments. This involuted interpretive stance, one sensitive enough to endow natural science with a place in the university, albeit quarantined with the practical and mechanical arts of engineering, also provided the natural sciences with their interpretation, with the attempt to extract their broader significance through their history, sociology, or their epistemological preconditions and requirements. In a similar way, the university interprets the events in the society around it, initially through reflections on jurisprudence, on the comparative history of constitutions, but soon enough through the fledgling human sciences, providing social, psychological, and cultural models and analogies through which contemporary events can be endowed with additional sense. In each case of what seems like a cosmopolitan expansion of the university's concern with the adventurous projects all around it, a duplication is occurring between science as it is conducted and science as it is interpreted, between society as it happens and society as it can be read. This is not so much an open-minded receptiveness on the university's part as an ingenious recycling of its media system. The book reservoir constantly inflated by critical commentary and written reduplication. In order to straddle and curriculate nature and society without having to become, in the process, a kind of experimental science or a form of politics, the university therefore has to, at least for the sake of student opinion, endow science and politics with an appropriate encapsulation in books, since it cannot emulate their operational or institutional forms, except perhaps in miniature, as university research or as student politics. Could the university avoid this strange and to an extent undignified and artificial duplication by stepping away from the terrains of nature and society and accepting, as Kant showed, that they have the complete logic and elements of their own rationality and practical conduct within them and don't require an interpretive detour through classrooms and books in order to remain united with their powers? Is there, in the third critique, a glimmer of a future for the media system that constituted the university and has remained its primary resource throughout, of which it seems to be thoroughly unaware? We know from Friedrich Kittler that 19th century Europe set up a media network around the book, which counts in its scope and radicalness, and perhaps the third great recycling of writing after manuscript culture and print. The exemplar of this change is not for once Kant, but a civil servant, serial seducer, poet, and playwright, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Kittler shows that in the hybrid writings of this great figure, a coalescence takes place for several movements in German culture. One to do with learning to read through interior sonification or vocalization rather than through memorization and rote. The other through the presentation of the mother tongue of a fundamental source of speech associated with women and learnt by all in the maternal-child bond. These and other elements provide the writing with a field of intelligibility all of its own. It is no longer just the relay of revealed or ancient truth that it was in manuscript culture, nor simply a preliminary collation of materials in preparation for a printed book. 19th century writing takes on an entirely new significance of its own. It has to master all regions of sensory experience, building on the sonification of the alphabet, which becomes the way in which reading is taught. From this inner sonic stream, poetry branches out to explore writing in every one of its sensory equivalents. Soon, all writing, past and present, becomes enlisted to activating experience and becomes interpretable through such experiences. Writing acquires an interior made up of all the elements that the 18th century grouped together as judgment. To be a competent reader is to be able to sustain and complete an hallucination, to experience the hero's exhaustion, the heroine's shyness, smell the perfumes of the forest, and hear the distant murmurings of the sea. It takes no ingenuity to recognize all the ingredients of Kant's reflective judgments here, in which the object of inquiry is bloodless and incomplete, until the inquirer, by following appropriate steps, lends their precarious stand in history, their quotient for vitality and the full range of their senses to giving it reality. The romantic reader, so carefully canvassed with Goethe's text, so deliberately addressed by pedagogy, by doctrines of child-rearing, and by the naturalization of women, especially mothers, as the source of all sense is expected to recreate the sensory order, locate themselves as alive in the present, and from this contribute to the free creation of culture, which for Kant is the only contribution humans can make to history. This is where aesthetics, considered by Kant as a program, becomes lodged. The university, by hastily opening its doors to the study of national literatures, musics, and arts, attempts to dislodge some of it, to disaggregate what the organic genius of Goethe had rendered as a unity into curricular content. Once the new media network has established this alloy of books and experience, and one becomes able to interpret the other. This breathes new life into the university's founding mandate of converting the written into speech and speech into writing. This process is now conceived of as a hermeneutic, a way of entering the closed circles of history, vitality, and the aesthetic, in order to set up in them another circle, or hopefully a spiral of interpretation, between the experience of history and its documents and relics, presence in life and all of its possible extensions, its ethical or disastrous ends, and the senses, that are now the keyboard on which all possible fictions and virtual worlds can be played. That these endeavors become confused with each other, that they blur their boundaries right from the start into interdiscipline, such as text interpreted as culture, and culture treated as text, history expressing vitality, and vitality acquiring a history of its own in Darwinian evolution, is beside the point and entirely to be expected when the university undertakes to provide its platform. The 18th century grand library, with an interpretable and, in today's terms, subjective interior, a model reader. If the 19th century university can rightly be called the aesthetic academy, for it applies nothing but the form of reflexive judgment to mark out its own territory. What happens when beneath these interpretative upheavals and innovation, a change occurs in its media network? This is where Kittler genuinely goes beyond Michel Foucault, who has up to this point been our guide to the era of representation, to the era of the book. The change in the media system is not something directly precipitated by the 19th century university endorsement and enthusiastic occupancy of aesthetic reading and interpretive writing. Its involvement is more oblique through those, in today's terms, nerdy outliers called the psychophysics laboratories. Here, propped up by physiology of the senses and by laboratory tools able to isolate and inject purer and purer physical, auditory, visual, tactile, and temporal stimuli into their experimental subjects. A number of researchers established that the senses have a powerful capacity to create illusion. In other words, that all by themselves, they are interpretative. The continuity of motion that links a succession of discrete images together in an animation or photograph into film, the phenomena of consonance and dissonance that have little direct correlation with the physical structure of vibrations, the depth perception that comes from simultaneously viewing two photographs taken from slightly different positions in space, all count as powerful illusions generated by the senses. In other words, autonomously at the heart of the aesthetic domain. Having set out to establish correlations between the psychic and the physical, adventurers like Wundt, Fechner, and Helmholtz arrived at a wonderland of endogenous illusions occurring, as it were, behind the back of the senses as well as the mind. Before these phenomena could be accurately assimilated, explained, or interpreted by the late 19th century academy, they were seized upon by technology aimed at assisting the sensorially impaired. The typewriter originated in the need to provide the blind with a braille writing device solely confined to touch. The telephone derived from the amplificatory hearing aid. These prosthetic uses of the findings of the psychophysical science rapidly spun into media for the non-impaired, the commercial typewriter, the gramophone as dictaphone and notary, and film as an instrument for reconnaissance, documentation, and magical entertainment. Here, Edison becomes the Goethe of America, the first society to mainstream these new media without reservations. No sooner had the university settled down to its new vocation of providing historical, vital, and sensory interpretation of the book, when the ingredients of this interpretation, sensory hallucination, were wrenched away and made into the direct content of the technological media. Dreaming on the outside, the cinema, dispersing the autograph into its elements on a keyboard and capturing the musical performance before any conventional symbolic notation can intervene and obscure it, are simply some of the consequences of applied psychophysics, which turns the Goethean book, and in its wake, the interpretative system of the university, which was in fact its only legitimate domain, inside out. The aesthetic now takes up residence in the non-interpretable format entirely of its own, which addresses the senses directly and requires no intervening activity of judgment. What had been the formidable interpretable vocabulary of the 19th century commentary and learning becomes replaced at a stroke by the technical specifications of media. Vertov and Eisenstein put together films through the media-metric vocabulary of montage, sequence, cutting, camera angle, and motion. Kandinsky and Klee write their fundamental treatises at the Bauhaus in the form of curriculae, technical exercises on the square, triangle, and line, from which all evaluative, contemplative, or in the old sense, aesthetic judgments are removed in favor of highlighting the intrinsic properties of the medium. You yourself can provide dozens of other examples from your fields of expertise, which indicate that modernism itself is little more than a shift away from the interpreted interiors of the 19th century academy and its books, towards the sensory experiences directly available and now designable and explorable through technological media, and which no longer serve the ancillary role of being the referent for print and writing, but are instead themselves the direct forms of experience. But of course, this time, delivered from outside the subject and the mind. If modernism is the triumph of the aesthetic, in that it finds a medium and a technology which gives the aesthetic a direct realization and an almost unbounded experimental field, then the critical component, which the 19th century had associated with the constraints and disciplines derived from the synthetic powers of judgment, correspondingly turns inside out in the 20th century. Completely new inquiries arise where the sensory, the organic, and the historic intersect, while they themselves, as topics, become exhausted. A perfect example of this is psychoanalysis, born in Freud's project for a scientific psychology, a bold systematization extrapolated from psychophysics, extended, in the intersection formed by personal history, the libido, the drive, and the access these have to the senses and to the kinds of consciousness and awareness that they shape around the bodily erogenous zones. This presents Kant's third critique, flayed and inverted, and turns the art of judgment into another kind of interpretation possible, only in the narrow and socially sterilized confines of the analyst's consulting room and the all-important transference that is established therein, which is today's form of reflexiveness. It is not surprising then that Kittler could show how intimately the analytic project of judgment is entwined in the technological media of the gramophone, the film, and the typewriter, or in Jacques Lacan's terms, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. The relationship between the aesthetic and the curriculum is either a Pandora's box or a treasure trove for the archaeologist or genealogist, historian of technology or of science. It is also an indication of how little the university has inherited, particularly the colonial university, at the end of so many mediations with which to reflect on itself, define its mission and powers, defend its legitimacy, or realign its allies. The great modernist critic, Clement Greenberg, defined academicism as the loss of awareness of the medium, and of course defined modernity as the single-minded focus on the particularities of the medium. The university has rejected the technological media, psychoanalysis, as well as all the uncomfortable parts of the modernist undertaking from its curricula. When it does entertain these, it is in the homeopathic dilutions of media or communication studies that try to provide interpretative content and critical or ideological unmasking of those very things that freed the 20th century of content, interpretation, or critique, and stand themselves as the transfiguration of ideology, since they are the direct fruits of the technology of illusion. When they are forced to confront psychoanalysis, they disperse it into the medical school, into the platitudes of psychological counseling, or apply it to the very books and libraries it uprooted in the departments of literary theory, which serve as the mortuaries for the 19th century university media system. Finally, modernity is either a puzzling speciality in departments of history or something practiced in the schools of music, architecture, film, or fine arts, which the university patronizingly finds incomprehensible and is only too pleased to subsume under one or another flavor of postmodernism, which of course bring back the 19th century interpretative academy disguised behind irony and cynicism. What the so-called practical degrees with their idiosyncratic curriculae and requirements are is nothing other than the university's unavoidable and belated contact with the technological media in their pure form. What they provide is an opportunity to engage with forces and resources, now over a century old, that uprooted the university from its Kantian dream of a pan-critical institution and forced it into its current exile, where the world in which it thinks is no longer the world in which it lives. Thank you.
I thought that was marvellous. I really thought that was an extraordinary performance. And as a professional historian, I'm tempted now to give another lecture in reply. What he says, of course, is absolutely correct about the 19th century university and asceticism which underpinned it, and which we all fundamentally approve of and like. But the problem was, in the 18th century, there were other forces that were emerging, such as enlightened despotism, such as the French Revolution and the left-wing Iliad that comes out of that, which have impinged and broken into the universities. So we have a sort of veneer of respectability about the aesthetics and what we want out of the aesthetics. The problem is that, as H.A.L. Fisher, who was professor of history at Oxford in the 1930s, said, that progress is not actually a law of nature. That aesthetics may be the best and the ideal and the thing we all want, but it's your enlightened despotism and your Iliad that are the ones that are going to come in because they have got the political power and the political might. But I won't give a lecture. Professor Delaporte, can you come and respond to this marvellous performance?
Well, I must say that I've come late, not to the feast, but to the massacre. I think that in an extremely gentle way, Professor Devroop has argued, made a strong case, for the unintended consequences of university reform, and not just any university reform, but the university reform which took place in Germany, and which has been so almost unreasonably successful as a model for all subsequent universities, and still stands as a model in those parts of the world who are embarking on these kinds of Western European universities. And I think Professor Devroop has, let's call him chats, you know, it's very artificial. We call each other a professor. It's like a mutual admiration society or mutual denigration society, depending on what you feel about professors. But I think that chats has, has shown just how precarious this program of university reform was, because you have a bunch of German thinkers who are frustrated in their political aspirations, and so they spend their time designing, instead of a politics, they spend their time designing ideal institutions. And into this aspiration comes the work of Immanuel Kant, who has basically said, these are the only three ways in which exercising your mind, your powers and your freedom and your action and your reflection, your judgment, can be fruitful. So they're saying, well, let's curriculate that. This chap has said these are the only three possible avenues of human inquiry that can count as rational. Let's design the university around this program. And so, of course, the university derives its legitimacy from philosophy. And philosophy continues to legitimize the university throughout the 19th century, and in some cases well into the 20th century. However, the university that undergoes this radical reform in Germany was not designed and did not originate in Germany. It had been around for a long time in the form of the University of Bologna. As Chats points out, it had been a theological library. And that library suddenly became secular, it became monetized. You could pay money to go and copy manuscripts and so on. And so it created a system typical of the university and remaining in the university to this day, which is a system of turning speech into writing and writing into speech. All that happened in the German university is that this exercise was provided with a stronger, a philosophical, a more minutely defensible rationale, and could be made much stronger arguments could be derived from it. But with the return of the university's awareness of its underlying media system, it's not just a body of ideas and goals, but it exists because it has and maintains a particular media system. With changes in this media system, shifts occur within knowledge and occur, of course, within the university and its general validity to knowledge that the university has no control of. In spite of this wonderful, very flexible, designed in heaven relationship between the Humboldt-type university and Kant, as soon as there are shifts in the media system, and the most devastating one of which is the shift to technological media, which Walter Benjamin reflected so much on. The shift to technological media turns experience inside out and completely voids aesthetic vocabulary because you no longer think interpretatively or use judgment. You think technically in order to get at aesthetic experience. You speak in terms of the technical specifications of media, and that's where the aesthetic becomes lodged. And throughout the 20th century, the university has the greatest difficulty coming to terms with the existence of technological media because they rock its own media system of reading and writing, and to that extent make its own archive unintelligible to itself. Even those two very radical alternatives to the university in the 20th century, the Bauhaus and the Frankfurt Institute, have great difficulties coming to terms with technological media, with the polytechnical model or the Frankfurt Institute, which takes this notion of critique and generalizes it so widely, are still today the two models of university reform, and they both have great difficulty and take opposing positions on technological media. Adorno's point on technological media was that they are vulgar and pointless. And the Bauhaus view of technological media is that there's nothing they cannot accomplish. So we find ourselves in a dilemma. And unfortunately, you seem to have taken the lid off this dilemma by inviting Chats to talk about aesthetics in the curriculum, which are exactly the point where the university is most opaque to itself. So I hope he agrees with my summary. But I find this, what he's presented, an enormous challenge. I find it interesting that he, as somebody who is always associated with technologies, particularly music technologies, with his association with such people as Stockhausen and so on, should raise this issue. And I find it very refreshing and very extraordinary that your School of Arts, which is unavoidably involved, unavoidably having to confront technological media, but with so little conceptual equipment lent to this task by the university. I find it refreshing that your School of Arts is really hosting this discussion, and that perhaps the reform that universities need, or the change, or the ways of reflecting on themselves that the universities need, might come from the way the schools of arts have to and will continue to involve themselves with media. So I guess that's all I have to say to what's been a very long and I think unsettling discussion in which many things have been turned inside out and flayed, and I think this indicates a certain sadomasochistic outlook in your new professor. But thank you very much.
Okay, the floor is open. It says questions and answers. There may be assertions as well made if people want. I haven't got an awful lot of time for the University of Bologna. It started, it advocated, and it profited by the largest and the biggest plagiarism act that has ever been committed in history. It sold its books to be copied, and our students have been doing that ever since. Any comments, ladies and gentlemen? Any questions for Chats? Chris, were you scratching your ear or were you putting your hand up?
Thanks for that. And just a question about, I'm trying to think of a larger context for this discussion. I don't want to see it as a historical presentation, interesting though it was. I'm sure that there's a kind of a contemporary relevance for this, right here, right now. And I want to know what that is. I'm trying to think about what that might be. I can't quite see it yet, and I can't quite see where you would want this to go. So I'm sure that's clear in your mind. Perhaps you could make it clearer in ours.
I came to this topic out of a problem that emerged in the department that I'm in, or they call it the cluster here, the cluster that I'm in. And naturally, I went to the Department of Teaching and Learning, and I have a lovely colleague, Dr. Dunpat, who's there. I said, look, I've got this problem. There are certain issues I have in the department, and I need to resolve this issue. On the one hand, I have a very strong and powerful jazz department of musicians who are trying to forge ahead with the curriculum that they're designing. On the other hand, I have a historical legacy within the department of an art music tradition. And there seems to be, from where I'm coming from, there seems to be a tension that has come through with these two. This is my observation. And so he says, well, look, I think you should chat to some of your colleagues in the quality performance section. And so I had the privilege of speaking to people like, I think the other day, Ruben Nike and Tilly, I forgot her name, Tiroveni. Her name is Tilly, I know it's Tilly. And she highlighted certain concerns about the way the qualifications have got to be presented and the number of problems that we have within our structure. And actually, when I applied for this job, my colleague, I can now call him my colleague, the very first point he raised it, what is the issue about the modules in the department? And I said, too many. And he said, Yes, I agree with you. So, if it's too many, how did we arrive at this point where we have too many modules? How is it this thing keeps growing and growing? And yet, for me, the one area that I see least growth in is the area that I've addressed here, in the media. How is it that the media seems to be sidelined and discussions around the media seem to be put on the aside, on the back burner? And this came through in the discussions around curriculum. I'm going to get to your point now, Prof. Ballantyne. This came through the discussions that the subject of which I teach, which is electroacoustic music or music technology, is an elective and not a core subject within the music discipline. And when I have to look at the field of music, particularly the launch of the gramophone, music had migrated entirely from the written manuscript into a different way, into a different media altogether, which is the recorded media in the form of the vinyl. It has gone even further with the process of digitization, and now we sit with computers. And I found that we need to somehow get a handle on where we are going with music today and where we sit with technology today. The tension that I find with most music departments in the country, and I stand to correction here, is that they seem to be still rooted in the learning and the music of the 19th century. And very few of them have actually got into the 20th century, with the exception of those few departments that have introduced jazz and very carefully brought in popular music, which hasn't quite manifested itself there yet, but it comes under the guise of jazz. So, looking at the way most of the musics that emerged in the 20th century, jazz, popular music, and most of the musics we have today, the crossover musics, and the way media is going and the problems that Prof. McCracken had just alluded to now at the University of Bologna, the issue of plagiarism and copying and copying and pasting raises serious issues today for us as a university. The very issue that was brought to me in my first week in the department was, we need to print more books, for our students to use this. And I'm thinking, well, hold on, we in the digital world, why can't you just get a PDF version? Why do you need to print more books when you could just give them a PDF of this? And what I've discovered is that last week, when I just got this paper down, I asked my students, so how many of you go and read books? And they looked around the class like to check, well, who's the nerd amongst us here? And it appeared to me that most of them access their information through the internet or YouTube. This is their first port of call. And sadly, for what it's worth, Wikipedia, I do it as well. If you throw a topic at me, my first, what shall I say, encyclopedia is the Wikipedia. And then I get my references and say, okay, let's go and explore this further from here, just to get a sense of where we're at. So I think these are the issues that have emerged in the department. It's still in its developmental stage. I don't know how far I can take this here at the university, but I'm being very ably supported, I know, and I'm pretty sure by yourself as well, to try and find a way that we can become relevant. The issue for me is becoming relevant to the society in which we live today. That for me is important, because I'm finding that more and more people who are not at university are making music than those who are actually at the university, with those at the university indulging in historical music activities, whilst those who are outside of the university are moving the field forward. And so these are the issues that had informed my thinking on this particular topic. So where do we go to from here? I think I would like this to be probably another seminar hosted by, not a seminar, but more a conference, around the topic of discussion, and looking particularly at the arts, which I think is problematic at all universities. Having read the not so pleasant report on my cluster, it occurred to me that the claims that were being made, or the observations, were generic to music departments in South Africa, and they were not unique to the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then I thought, well, then something is happening here. And thanks to Dr. Dunpat for opening this discussion. So I'm hoping that we can take this further and better inform the university as to how they see the arts at the university, and how we can put mechanisms in place to measure the arts by being informed by the practitioners themselves, which is the dilemma we find ourselves in, which you've spearheaded for several years, Prof. Ballantyne, in trying to get recognition for performing artists. You know, and I think this is where I'm hoping the discussion would go there, that we could finally come to some point of agreement that the arts and you know, the other arts as well, apart from music, can have not its own, can have its space and its elbow room within the university without constantly being hammered on issues of publication, research, output, and issues like that. So I think this is the start. You know, I mean, there's a lot of issues here that I've just thrown up. You know, probably upset some of you in the process, but I think it's an academic's duty, you know, to provoke. So I think I've taken that liberty. I hope I've answered. This is a very elaborate answer, but I hope I've touched on some of the points.
I think it is so refreshing that the title of academic leadership is living up to its description, which is academic leadership, because we've moved so much into just administrative leadership. And so I think we're going to take a page out of your book to kind of do our own academic leadership in this way, to intellectualize the discussion and beyond, you know, money and appointments and so on. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Chats, implicit in your presentation, thank you very much for the presentation, but implicit in there is some kind of challenge to what we, first of all, decide the media is, what you're talking about when you're talking about media. It's not just technology. I assume it's also the location of artistic exchange. But also in that sort of undercurrent is this idea of, so what do we value as knowledge? Because I think it's quite important if we're looking at transforming the curriculum, not only to look at relevance, but to look at who's deciding what is relevant.
The lessons there could be determined from the recent occurrences at our universities. Academics have a perspective on what they would see as being relevant. And we heard this the past 6 months that the university is being questioned. Students are questioning the legitimacy of what it is we do at the university. And those are the issues that I did touch on in my paper, which was the concluding slide. If you looked at that, the very last slide that we actually put up there, who decides this? Who decides where we should be going? And I must say, I have to accuse myself here also of being historicist in my approach, because I haven't quite got to the point beyond Kittler where those technologies we're talking about, which is film, typewriter, and the gramophone, have now converged into this device. So I didn't quite get to this point yet. Probably another hour I would probably get there. So I think the issue of relevance, one has to look at, firstly, what are the sector needs and what are the drivers for those sectors? One needs to be very honest with oneself. And we do understand that in any discipline, there is a core or there is a body of information or knowledge that we would need. But to what extent that body of knowledge needs to take the place or what should be relevant, I think that's a debate that the academics are going to have to engage with. And I think we've had scholars over the years who actually, Clement Greenberg was one example, who just went right against that. You know, there are several, Harold Bloom is the other one. You know, Harold Bloom also went against this whole idea of what constitutes the canon, and he questioned the canon by raising several issues in that. So I think that's something that's important for us, because when I look at my students, our students, and I constantly discuss with my students in class, what do they find relevant? Where do they see themselves in 5 years? And this comes partly from my experience, which I think probably 2 members or 3 or 4 in the audience here probably know about my history. It had to go to several mutations. First started off being some recorder player down deep south, and I had to constantly reinvent myself because I had to, on the one hand, be relevant, second hand, to put food on the table for my family, and in order to put food on the table, I had to be relevant. That's the bottom line. I couldn't play Baroque recorder sonatas throughout the year and hope that I'm going to survive. It just wouldn't work. So I had to reinvent myself, and using that as an experience, I use that as my yardstick for my students. And so I think one needs to look at what is available today. And I think the lessons are there to be learned. Looking at the media, I think today we have access to stuff that we would have never had 20 or 30 years ago. And Thomas Friedman's book, I think, should be the starting point. The world is flat in the 21st century. I think that should be the starting point for this discussion. I hope I've answered your question, Catherine.
I'm sorry if I'm going to ask a question that feels like it's possibly not really directly related to what you say, but I wanted to tap in while I could to your thoughts on it. And I suppose it stems from when I looked at the invitation to come to your talk. I was hoping you would maybe touch, I don't know why, it was something about what you wrote, that you would touch on how we teach as well. And it made me think when you started by playing your instrument for us, you performed for us. And some of, I think, related stuff that needs to be discussed around curriculum is the performance of teachers. And so I kind of hoped you would talk a little bit about teaching as performance. Because I think that there's something else happening at the moment where there isn't a focus on the development. Well, there is a focus, but I think what's got lost a lot in the whole need for us to be rated against research output has been a loss of focus on the importance of how we teach and what we bring to the teaching experience. And I don't know why, I felt that, just the way you played your instrument, that kind of resonated with me about, I like to see myself as a performer when I teach, and that's part of the aesthetics of education. But I just wanted your thoughts on it. I'm sorry if it seems kind of out there. It's
very important, to look at the aspect of pedagogy. I was thrown a googly by Dr. Dunpert, I was went to his office to have a cup of coffee to talk about some financial issues, and he said, listen, I got a topic for you I'd like you to talk on. And I said, okay, fine. And then he sends me this topic, and I'm like, man, this is a horrible topic you've just given me. What the heck do I do with this? Then I went back to him 2 days thereafter. I said, listen, can I have a chat with you about this? He says, take it and go with it. Let's see what you come up with. You're the new kid on the block. Let's see what you have to say. I'm not going to give you... And when I sent him my title, he says, look, my title was very different from what I have here. And he says, no, I think you should start to fix your title to say something like, Sensing the Curriculum. And I was like, oh, I'm back to my days of Education 1 and Education 2. And I've left that a long time ago. But listening to what you have to say, I think is very important. Musicians, particularly in the field of the arts, where we are engaged on a one-on-one teaching, there is a different aspect of us as opposed, I stand correction here, as opposed to people who teach in much larger groups. I find that by interacting with my students on a one-on-one, there's a part of me, there's a part of my spirit and the way I see things that gets transmitted in this process that I cannot write about or talk about. Now, I had this experience yesterday with my colleague, Neil Gonzalez. I'm doing my staff with one-on-one sessions, trying to speak to my colleagues as to how we can move forward. And I questioned him about his doctorate. I said, look, could you tell me about your doctorate? What's happening? Why aren't you getting this off the ground? And he says, you know what? I find it a very laborious process to sit and go through this drudgery of writing stuff. I've got so many new ideas coming at me all the time in my playing, and I much rather explore these things and these aspects. I find, and this is what he tells me, he says, with my students, I find my students are the ones who inspire me to move forward with what they bring. And this is for me when the light bulb went off. I thought, here we have it. And that's, I think, speaking to your point, that in his case as well, he finds that his students bring him to new territory, into uncharted waters what they're playing, which I think I would agree with you. And maybe we can speak to our colleague here who sits with the money in his department, who could maybe sponsor us a nice weekend where we can have different papers. I think a publication, if not, coming out of this with different authors.
So let's drift a bit away from the monetary dimensions of our existence. That's really the least of our concerns. More importantly is how we've been veered, steered by that dimension into a kind of blindness about what is possible beyond the glitter. So, how did this come about? Well, I welcomed Chats to the university. And for me, he brought in a freshness and what I call a pedagogy of hope and possibility. Now, some of you will know that the country is going through a new cycle of curriculum reform, one of several that we have undergone over the past few decades, none of which has gained any significant traction to change the condition of higher education. So this new cycle is as technicist and technocratic as previous cycles have been. Perhaps even more so, because it lacks the fundamental philosophical debate that's going on in this room today. Because technocrats have been entrusted with the responsibility of re-envisioning a new curriculum. And these technocrats are saying things like, there is an irreducible core of the curriculum that cannot be tampered with. What they're referring to, of course, is the ancient forms, or more recent forms, such as the Oxbridge model. So the challenge that Chats has is to reinvigorate the curriculum with a new hope through the aesthetics, through the performance. And this is the beginning, I hope, of many conversations around the curriculum, so that we do not fall into the technocratic trap that we are being driven into. We are under threat as a university of losing our autonomy because we are relinquishing our responsibility for debate to technocrats. I'm imploring you to take back the university.
I want to share with you something that I experienced more than 25 years ago, and that was going to the head of the university and saying, we need to have African music at this university. And he said, African music at the university? Are you out of your mind? So I thought, well, I'll leave it until he goes away. He went away, and the next person came, and I said the same thing. He said, but there's no money. I said, we'll find it. And we did find the money about 20 years ago. I just wanted to say, it must come from the bottom up. It won't come from the top down. Thanks, Chats, for what you said.
It strikes me what we have here is anarchy appearing. I mean, when we start questioning the curriculum as set down by the norms and standards, we're in big trouble. And maybe we have an intellectual free thinker here to our left. And that is exactly what this university needs at this time, I think. There was on the old Oregon Trail, there was a notice in the 1840s which simply read, "The cowards never started and the weak died along the way." Well, I assure you of this, that Professor Devroop is neither a coward nor is he weak, and I think watch this space. Professor Amin, will you come and sew the business of the day up for us, please? Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must tell you that I was duped into coming today. I was told by Longelo, who's sitting there at the back, that the Guptas would be present. So I came with my tender and my propositions, and it's been a misfortune, but a very fortunate one. I am pleasantly surprised by the level of intellectual debate, discussion, and of course, as Donald has alluded, to the courage to go onto this path. But I want to tell you that we are with you. I think we've reached the lowest point that we could, and we are now ready to rise. And so it's not going to be the machines. It certainly is going to be the minds. So I just want to also say that that man that you're thanking so endlessly today, you will regret it. As I know, you will get endless work, and Oh dear, I don't want to say anything. I don't know whether I'm employed in the School of Education or by UTLO, but I know that I do more work for them. So welcome to the club. I just want to say a few things. I've been reflecting as you were speaking about Eco Umberto's work, you know, that great thinker who died earlier this year. And he wrote 2 books, one on beauty and one on ugliness. And of course, the one on beauty is a history of Western ideas, in which he pulled out the ugliness, the silenced and the forgotten histories and ideas from Africa, from the South Americas, from Japan, from India, and all those forgotten places. And of course, in his book on ugliness, he wanted to know, is repulsiveness also in the eye of the beholder? And I thought as you spoke that on the aesthetics, you spoke so much about its ugliness. And so I want to thank you for that. So I think you did a typical deconstructive move without telling us that. So it was very perverse and underhanded, but I think it got the message through. So I was wondering how Kant would have dealt with these 3 in the present day: the SRC, the Minister of Higher Education, and the media, not the media in the university, talking of the larger media. I also want us to consider how the lecture that you spoke about is now about teaching to pass. And somehow I think we have an opportunity to retrieve the ethics of the aesthetics, because we're all in the arts, and it is our duty to do so. We have to save this planet for the post-human one that's coming, in which we think we're the only survivors, but we're on our way to death and destruction. So with that, I want to thank you for that. Just to say that I know Rabi said we mustn't speak about money and so on, but you'll see how perverse the economics are. I have a gift to the esteemed professor from Johannesburg, who kind of commended you on what you said. Let me just get that. Professor Jean-Pierre Delaporte. Thank you. Alternation was given to you because Rabi is one of the authors.
So on behalf of the Gupta family, I offer you the post of Minister.
Thank you. Dev, your gift is in the mail. Okay. Thank you all. Just to say that the bar, there's a cash bar that's open. It's all about money, Rabi. And no, yeah. But there is some eats, I think. Are there any eats left? Sorry. Thank you all. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you. I now invite you over to the bar. It's not free. You got to pay because I'm accountable for the money at the end of the day. Thank you.